Right. Hello. Thank you very much for coming to see this evening one of Britain's and one of the world's greatest living epidemiologists. I first met George. I didn't know what he looked like, but I knew his work, and it was the first time I'd ever done a public talk. And afterwards, a few people were milling around, and literally every topic that came up, this guy in an anorak with a bald head would go, "Oh yeah, I did a paper on that." And after that had happened about 8 separate clinical and epidemiological topics, I said, "Are you George Davey Smith?" And he said, "Oh yeah, I am." Previously best known as the frontman of extreme noise terror outfit Scum Auxiliary, now earning a living as an epidemiologist in Bristol. This is George Davey Smith.
So thanks so much for the invitation to come here. I've had a fantastic day so far, and now I'm going to make you suffer for the enjoyment that I've had. And I'm going to talk about triangulation of evidence. And I'm going to show that yet again, I can't move the PowerPoints, but there must be a reason. Okay, I'll move them that way then. So I'm going to say why we need triangulation of evidence, the basis of the variety of evidence thesis, give some examples, and then discuss the essential role of protocol development, pre-registration, and then potential limitations. And this first section on why triangulation, for those of you who are here for the Mendelian randomization talk this lunchtime, this is the sort of background for why Mendelian randomization was developed as well. And the why triangulation is because it became clear about 25 years ago that observational epidemiology was generating findings that were simply not recapitulated by randomized trials. So there was 2 back-to-back papers in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1993 on vitamin E supplement use and risk of coronary heart disease. So this was a very large observational study in which people reported whether they used vitamin E supplements. Many other things were measured in those people. They were followed up, whether they had coronary heart disease events, and then the standard statistical adjustment for all the factors that one thought could be confounding factors was made. And it was shown that vitamin E supplementation was associated with about a third reduction in coronary heart disease risk. And that was a study in the health professionals, a male cohort of health professionals, and it was replicated in the next paper in the same issue of New England Journal of Medicine, and the nurses' health study showed exactly the same finding. So you had replicable findings on taking vitamin E supplements. So the exposure was people who reported that they opened the jar, they took a supplement, and they swallowed a supplement. That was the exposure that was being examined in this observational study. It was high profile. It took Bill Clinton off the front page of the lead article in the New York Times. The report is vitamin E greatly reduces risk of heart disease, studies suggest. So that's got obviously causal interpretation. It's saying reduces. Reduces means it's actually having an effect. And you could see the effect was seen in just about 2 to 4 years of taking the supplements that was associated with this substantial reduction in coronary heart disease risk. Now, the subjects in these studies, as I say, was the nurses in the nurses' health study, all female in this study, and male health professionals. And of course, they follow the medical news. There was a dramatic increase in use of vitamin E supplements amongst the participants of the study. Up to half of them were taking vitamin E supplements by 1998. And the male health professionals followed. Even a slightly higher proportion started taking vitamin E supplements. And the general population in the US, vitamin E supplement use, either a single supplement or as part of a multivitamin, reached about 40%. So they weren't unrepresentative of the population. Of course, then randomized controlled trials were done of precisely the exposure under investigation, taking a supplement, swallowing it once a night, once a day, and having a placebo supplement. And that was what was tried in the trials. With up to 13 years of follow-up, large-scale trials ruled out any meaningful benefit of taking vitamin E supplements. And as I say, these were well-educated participants, and they followed the news and they stopped taking vitamin E supplements. So we saw that with vitamin E. Now the vitamin E paper, the vitamin E studies got published in the New England Journal of Medicine and on the front page of the New York Times. They showed the same results for beta-carotene, presented an abstract at the same time as they presented the vitamin E. But this never made it to the New England Journal of Medicine. But just the abstract, the publication of the abstract, led to the news got known by the participants and by the rest of the US, and people started taking beta-carotene supplements. But here we notice a fall is happening rather earlier than for vitamin E. And that is because in 1994, the first large trial of beta-carotene appeared, showing no reduction in cardiovascular disease or cancer mortality and morbidity. So this sort of shows that you can get things which look very robust in observational data, but are false, are just clearly wrong. Taking vitamin E supplements did not reduce cardiovascular disease, nor did taking beta-carotene. So this suggests that just replicating studies, we all hear there's a replication crisis, but we need to replicate studies. Now that's true, but replicating studies beyond a certain level just simply asymptotes in value, and indeed might become the reverse of being valuable because it strengthens people's belief in the phenomenon. And of course, when you're replicating studies in very similar populations, where there's the same sort of confounding structure, people who better off people who are healthier, people who have better health protective behaviors, etc., will take the supplements. And you can't adjust for that, as I discussed this morning, statistically. So just simply repeating studies with the same design does not strengthen evidence, and indeed it can begin to damage the situation. This is a meta-analysis that Matthias Egger and I did many, many years ago of the then observational studies on beta-carotene and the randomized trials in cardiovascular disease, showing the rather stark difference in the inferences that were made. And what was quite interesting with this carotene situation was that studies then that had been presented as abstracts never appeared, because the people knew what the results of the trials were. And then some studies appeared that managed to reanalyze data and managed to say, well, the effects were getting weaker or whatever in the observational studies. Knowing what the answer is does indeed give you ways of getting your results nearer to the answer. And this has been shown many times. This is an example actually from the social sciences, but this is a paper where the same data set was given to 73 research teams, and the hypothesis that was to be tested in those data was explained. And these 73 research teams then went away and interrogated this data set to see whether they found things in support of the hypothesis or going against the hypothesis. And what was found was this rather remarkable finding that 17% found significance is banned in Bristol. You can't say significant, but the people who wrote this paper did, i.e. p less than 0.05. They found significant evidence in one direction, and over a quarter of them found significant evidence in the other direction, and less than 2/3 actually came up with there not being, statistically significant evidence. But this is just people making different analytical choices about precisely the same data set. You can get different answers with when you're looking or have a strong hypothesis in a particular direction. So the important thing is to use a variety of evidence when you have different methods and domains of data that will not simply follow the same pattern of bias. So you need to think of what the biases are, and you need to think of ways of getting evidence that will not suffer from that bias. And you can have intuitive and formal reasoning about when the independence of the direction and magnitude of biases would exist. An example that I gave this morning would be with HDL cholesterol and coronary heart disease. The randomized trials showed no benefit of raising HDL cholesterol. Mendelian randomization also shows no benefit of raising HDL cholesterol. The trials could be biased, of course. You can have informative dropout. Compliance might relate to characteristics on how people respond to the treatments, might lead to them stopping it if they're healthy and keeping going if they're not, or vice versa, etc. Randomized trials can be biased. Mendelian randomization can be biased, as I talked at length about, by pleiotropy. But pleiotropy in genetic variants related to HDL cholesterol would not influence the sorts of biases you would get in randomized trials. Those biases would be orthogonal to each other. And that is what you're ideally looking for in triangulation. You're looking for designs for which the biases are orthogonal. And establishing mechanisms linking exposure and outcomes, I think, is also an important and sometimes underrated component of evidence. So, examples of variety of evidence in etiological epidemiology. So first we have conventional observational studies. The problem with conventional observational studies is that they follow the equation of saying that there should be no unmeasured confounding and no measurement error. Those are the two requirements for conventional observational epidemiological study to be reliable. To have those two things means that you are not looking at epidemiological data. And there are many flavors of observational studies, and people are now using the terms like real-world evidence and target trials, but they're observational data. And giving them those names doesn't automatically make them more evidential. So a second approach is to look at different contexts where the main source of confounding, for example, will differ between those contexts. So an example of this was looking at breastfeeding and different health outcomes in both the Alspach and Pelotas study. Alspach, mentioned earlier as well, Avon longitudinal study of parents and children, followed up a large number of births around 1991, the most intensively studied large population from birth there's been in the world. And breastfeeding, of course, was very good data were gathered on breastfeeding, and very good data were gathered at 60 stages of the life course on potential confounding factors. But then breastfeeding was looked at in relation to lots of outcomes. And in Alspach, breastfeeding essentially predicted everything that was good, including lower blood pressure, lower body mass index and lower risk of obesity, higher IQ, and many other things, including the expense of the Christmas presents the children got. So you could fit a model that showed the same statistical model, which would show that breastfeeding reduced your blood pressure, showed that breastfeeding increased the expense of your Christmas presents. So in Alspach, of course, at that time, the better off families, the more educated mothers, etc., were more likely to breastfeed. And Richard Martin carried out a systematic review of about 50 studies carried out in the same sorts of settings as Alspach. And you got beautiful estimates, beautifully precise estimates of breastfeeding being related to lower blood pressure, lower body mass index, etc. But the problem is that they were, like the vitamin E studies in nurses and health professionals in the US, they were confounded in exactly the same way. So Mary Jo Brian, who was doing a PhD at the time, she went to Pelotas in southern Brazil, where a birth cohort had been set up in 1982 by Cesar Victora. And at the time these two, Alspach and Pelotas, were set up, In Alsbach, there was, as you might imagine, there was very strong association between socioeconomic factors and breastfeeding. There was more breastfeeding in the better off groups. In Pilotus, there was little association. This is just repeating the same thing. There's very big, large associations in Alsbach, no associations in Pilotus. So the confounding structure would obviously be very different in Alsbach and Pilotus. And when Mary Jo looked at blood pressure, she did indeed find that, in Alsbach, being breastfed was related to lower blood pressure, lower body mass index, and higher cognitive ability. In Pilotus, with weak social patterning, there was little evidence with respect to blood pressure. BMI, in fact, went in the opposite direction, but a similar direction of association was seen for IQ. She then looked at a collaboration called the cohorts collaboration, which is a collaboration of cohorts all in low and middle income countries, all of which did not have the same confounding of breastfeeding as was seen in Alsbach. And in this consortium of cohorts, you could establish a difference between the apparently protective effects in Alsbach on blood pressure and body mass index and the sort of null, basically near null effects in the cohorts consortium. But unfortunately, the cohorts consortium didn't have IQ data or cognitive ability data. And Richard Martin, again, with Mike Kramer, who set up the Belarus study, looked at the long-term effects in the only large-scale randomized trial that has been done of breastfeeding, which was done in Belarus, which was the place which had the lowest breastfeeding rate at the time Mike set the study up. It was a cluster randomized trial of randomizing hospitals to breastfeeding promotion or no breastfeeding promotion. In the promotion group, the breastfeeding rates at 3 months went up from the 4% baseline to a 30-odd% rate at 3 months. And you saw that same difference in randomization. And in the follow-up that Richard and Mike did, they also found that the randomization to breastfeeding promotion was not related to blood pressure and BMI, but was related to greater cognitive ability. So there you see a situation where you deliberately go out to get contexts where confounding and the biases will be distinct. Now, the sorts of contexts you choose needn't just be geographical. You can choose time as a context. So we all know now that eating fried food is really bad for you. And this is just one of many studies from the US, this in the BMJ, just showing that fried food relates to higher cardiovascular disease, cancer mortality, everything bad, in fact. So if we go back about 50 or 60 years, you also have data on the US at a time when eating fried food was not an indicator of being poor. It was an indicator of, if anything, being better off because the fried food was steak. And these were the results, and this is my favorite data slide I'm going to show today. This is eating fried food from 1 to 2 times a week to 15 plus times a week. I love that. That's not just dinner, not just lunch and dinner. You're having a fried breakfast at least 1 day a week as well. That's just brilliant, isn't it? And what you see is just your mortality rates just go down. The more fried food you eat, the lower your mortality. You can't get too much fried food. I'm not saying this argues against fried food and health, but at least it makes you consider the extent to which confounding may exist. So a third type of approach is the use of what are called negative controls. So a negative control will be something which is either is not a plausible cause or is not a plausible outcome of an exposure. So you have negative control outcome studies, negative control exposure studies. And this is from over 3 decades ago when we used this approach to interrogate an association between smoking and suicide, which was being widely publicized. Many people were doing studies of smoking and suicide. It was argued that, smoking has an effect on brain serotonin. That's sort of that increases your risk of suicide. And in the Mr. Fit study of 1/3 of a million men, we replicated this strong association between smoking and suicide. We adjusted for all the confounders we actually had available. But of course, when you think about smoking can be used as sort of medication, self-medication for depression. And also, if you're depressed, you might find it rather difficult to give up one of the things you actually enjoy. So we tried to think of a thing which might be patterned similarly to suicide, an outcome, but was not plausibly caused by it. And so we thought of being murdered. And being the US, you had enough data to actually look at being murdered. And sure enough, the more you smoked, the more likely you were to be murdered. Now, serotonin in your brain isn't going to lead to you getting murdered to that degree. So this, I think, casts some doubt on this. The only causal explanation we could think of for this was that the paramilitary wing of the health education groups were going around shooting smokers as the ultimate deterrent for their behavior. Of course, today's miasma is ultra-processed food. Ultra-processed food is poison, and it relates to every socially patterned health outcome there is. For example, it relates to head and neck cancer. And this is work by Fernanda Morales-Bernstein, a PhD student in Bristol. And she sort of replicated, in a very large data set, she replicated what people had found with ultra-processed food consumption. But then she looked at accidental death, and ultra-processed food consumption was also related to accidental death. Again, not something that it's easy to make a sensible causal argument about. So that's negative control outcomes. Again, the biases will be orthogonal to the sorts of biases seen in other studies. You can also have negative control exposures. And here we have an example of a negative control exposure, which is the dad's smoking while the mother is pregnant with the child. And this is for something which clearly is causal. Smoking during pregnancy does reduce birth weight of offspring. And then if you look at the dad smoking, there's a small effect which relates to the assortative mating by smoking behavior, and you adjust for maternal smoking, and that goes to null. That's what a cause looks like. And then you look at child obesity, because smoking during pregnancy is like not being breastfed. It relates to everything bad. It can be attributed to this, including child obesity. But when you look at the childhood BMI, you see pretty similar effects for the dad smoking during pregnancy and the mum smoking during pregnancy. And obviously, they both will be related to the sort of family socioeconomic position and behaviors within the family, etc. They would relate in similar ways. There's other methods would include within SIBSHIP studies. I discussed these again in Mendelian randomization talk in that context. But of course, if you take siblings, they are sort of matched for factors that in the family that exist from birth till when they sort of leave the family home. And so if you're looking at childhood outcomes, which we did a lot of in ALSPAC, for example, then between SIBs is a powerful study design. We also have regression discontinuity designs when some exposure changes at a very particular point. You can see whether outcomes change at that point as well, which suggests that they are related. And here's an example of coronary artery bypass grafting and mortality in the US. The guidelines suggest 80 is the age at which you cease to do just routine cabbages for people getting admitted with particular characteristics, and so you can look at age and whether people get a cabbage. And what this looks at is people who are admitted 2 weeks before their 80th birthday, or around 2 weeks after their 80th birthday. And what you see for this group around 80 is you see that that 4-week difference makes quite an effect on whether you get a cabbage, and it has quite an effect on mortality. So the lesson here is, no one here is really old enough for this, probably except me, but if you get admitted to an A&E in the US, tell them you're 79. Never say that you're 80 or over. Just say I'm 79 and keep insisting on it until they've actually got the anesthetic out for you. Then we have Mendelian randomization, and this is where I've got a little natural experiment that I mentioned earlier going on here. I've shown this animation in many, many institutions because for reasons I'll give after it. And I've found that the more prestigious the institution, the less likely it is that the animation will have been set up so it works. So now we're going to try the experiment to see whether the animation works here. So this is, sorry. And we need the sound. Turn it up. Epidemiologists are interested in understanding factors related to health and disease. Do smokers tend to die younger than non-smokers? It certainly looks that way. But disentangling cause and effect can be difficult. Smokers are different on average from non-smokers. They're more likely to drink heavily and have less healthy diets. But even if we measure these confounding factors, we may not measure them perfectly, or there may be others that we haven't measured. Also, as people become ill, they may cut down or give up smoking, which could wrongly suggest that reduced smoking leads to worse health. We could randomly assign 50,000 people to smoke and 50,000 people to not smoke and follow them up to monitor their health. This removes the possibility that any other factor could be responsible for any differences we see in their long-term health. But this is neither ethical nor practical. Fortunately, we have all been recruited into an experiment without knowing it at the point at which we were conceived. Our genes, which are passed on randomly from generation to generation, influence how much we eat, sleep, drink, smoke and more. These genetic influences are not affected by anything else you may or may not choose to do in your life. They're not related to confounding factors. We can use this knowledge to learn about cause and effect, grouping people according to their genetic code. This method is called Mendelian randomization. For example, smokers who carry one version of a gene called CHRNA5 tend to smoke less heavily than those who carry a different version. When we group people according to which version of this gene they have, we find that the people with the version of the gene associated with heavier smoking do indeed die younger. But is the gene influencing how long we live in some other way? We don't think so. When we look at the same gene in non-smokers, there's no effect on life expectancy, so the effect must be driven by smoking. Using this method, we can show that smoking causes lung cancer, heart and respiratory disease, and many other diseases, but does not seem to influence depression or anxiety. Mendelian randomization has already begun to tell us about factors that influence our risk of disease. Now we're using the same approach in other ways to look at several risk factors together and to look at what influences disease progression, which may help us to develop new treatments. So you're lucky because this morning people got an hour on Mendelian randomization. Yeah, just back to the slides. Yeah. So no. Yeah, the reason I showed that is I can't explain Mendelian randomization in 2 minutes, except when I play my recording. And secondly, is that this recording is now very close to when I start getting money from YouTube. I will get a penny if this is watched not that many more times. So when you go home, I want you to watch it again and again and again. Get your kids to watch it. It has to be a different IP device, IP number, but just watch it again and again and again. This is my alternative career for when Bristol University tell me it's time to retire. So that's Mendelian randomization, which I'm not going to explain more, but I'm going to give an alternative use. This will make sense to people who are here this morning. I'm going to use an alternative use of genetics, which is genetics to understand confounding, which I think is a really exciting approach, which is actually saying if we can't instrument something like noodle consumption that I talked about, we could at the very least look at what factors actually influence that. And by using Mendelian randomization, you can estimate the association, the non-causal association that those factors would generate between the exposure and outcome. And here's an example of that, and it's my old friend HDL cholesterol. But now it's HDL cholesterol in relation to sepsis risk. So HDL cholesterol observationally appears to, especially the small HDL cholesterol particles in particular, observationally appears to be really quite strongly protective of, in that direction, of sepsis. And this has been published a couple of times. We replicated it in a much bigger study and found the same thing as everyone else had found. But if you did the Mendelian randomization, there was no evidence of a reliable association. Now, we'd also shown, this is all Gus Hamilton's work, but we'd also shown that IL-6 receptor blockade appears to reduce the sepsis outcomes. So IL-6 receptor blockade is what tocilizumab, which was used as a treatment during COVID, was obviously trialed in the recovery trial. That tocilizumab does. It blocks the IL-6 receptor. And Michael Holmes and others had published Mendelian randomization work before the recovery trial appeared, well before the recovery trial appeared, suggesting that benefit would be seen. So here you see IL-6 appears to be, IL-6 receptor blockade appears to be protective of sepsis, including sepsis mortality. It's also...
Can you just say what the things like were for my previous
yeah, this is IL-6 receptor blockade using the IL-6 receptor variant, which mimics IL-6 receptor blockade, mimics tocilizumab, and that relates to lower sepsis, either 28-day death in critical care, lower sepsis in critical care, lower sepsis 28-day death, including not in critical care, and just overall sepsis. So related to a whole stack of sepsis outcomes, and here it is related to a stack of COVID outcomes. So this suggests that maybe tocilizumab should be considered in sepsis, but also it shows something which is likely to be a strong confounder of HDL, the small HDL particles, and sepsis outcomes. And sure enough, what you see is the IL-6 receptor variant relates to lower, the variant which does the opposite, relates to lower small HDL cholesterol, and the CRP shows no effect. So you can also have non-genetic instrumental variables, and a non-genetic instrumental variable, for example, would be, for example, the use of the change in cigarette taxation in different American US states that occur over time, and then that results in lower smoking, and then you can look for downstream effects of smoking using cost taxation as your instrumental variable. There's many other non-genetic IVs, and obviously you can have randomized controlled trials, which are, when you can do them, are extremely powerful. I talked about maternal smoking and birth weight of offspring as something which is definitely causal, and this is a very good example of something which just triangulates very well. I mean, the conventional observational studies show it, of course, but cross-context comparisons show it, looking at places where smoking is actually more done by people, if anything, of higher socioeconomic position rather than poorer folk. Negative control studies show it, as I've already mentioned. Within SIBSHIP studies show it. But the designs I've gone through, and given the time, I've only gone through a few. There are many designs, and so in the specific question you want to use, you may have different designs you can use. So for example, in maternal smoking and birth weight of offspring, you can look at children of MZ twins. And this is rather powerful, because if you had monozygotic twins, sisters, twin sisters, identical twin sisters, one of them smokes, one of them doesn't, you get perfect matching on genotype, and you get matching on childhood environment, etc. And so there's matching on many confounders that wouldn't be matched for in other designs. There's MR, which shows maternal smoking lowers birth weight of offspring. There's non-genetic IVs. The tax example I gave shows lower birth weight in relation to greater smoking, and there's 2 small randomized controlled trials. So as I said, the important issue is the independence of bias. that you think that you want to think of study designs where the direction of bias is likely to be different. And it is possible, and I'm not going to go through this in detail, I recommend reading the paper. It is possible in principle that you could demonstrate this. If you had a really large number of all these different study types, you can actually demonstrate the different direction of bias. But I don't know any example that actually has enough data to do that. Now, of course, you want to think about, when you triangulate and you do all these different designs, you want to think about to what extent is it ever possible to quantify this. And of course, you need to think about your estimand, i.e. what is the relationship, the causal effect that you are trying to estimate? Is it the causal effect of smoking for 5 years? Is it the causal effect of a lifetime difference in LDL cholesterol? Is it a causal effect of 5 years difference in HDL cholesterol, in LDL cholesterol? And this is just a slide. Sometimes it's possible to scale the estimands because you think one estimand will be a sort of subcategory of another. So, for example, in the LDL cholesterol example, you would expect that lifetime differences in LDL cholesterol would have greater effects than would the 5 years difference that you get in a randomized trial of statins, for example. And as I sort of showed earlier, what you see when putting up the Mendelian randomization studies, which are the genetic studies, these are studies that use genetic variation in the target of matched drug. So they use genetic variation in the HMG reductase drug, and they statins, and they use genetic variation in that gene, which is the target of statins, and they compare that to statin trials. They use genetic variation, the Niemann-Pick C1-like-1 gene, which relates to cholesterol transport across the gut, and they look at ezetimibe, which targets Niemann-Pick C1-like-1, etc. Match them all up, and what you see is that genetic studies show a considerably larger protective effect of lower LDL cholesterol. You get about 35–40% of the effect in 5 years of statins. Now, this makes sense, of course, because atherosclerosis starts in childhood. 18-year-old American soldiers killed in the Korean War already had atheroma. You wouldn't expect that giving people a drug at 50 would reverse that to a full extent. So in this situation, you could sort of reasonably scale the estimands and then meta-analyze them even. You obviously would do your analysis within study type, and you'd look at heterogeneity within study type, and then within and between study type. So comparing methods, I've already discussed LDL cholesterol. You can combine two approaches, and that's done there. There's a review, if anyone's interested in the MR versus RCTs. Here's a review of MR versus RCTs studies. You can combine Mendelian randomization and negative control outcomes. I discussed the nonlinear MR of the effect of BMI on all-cause mortality, which suggested that there was actually a sort of being below a BMI of 25 was beneficial. But then when you look at a negative control in relation to this exposure, you see that using this same method, this same nonlinear method, low BMI also makes you more male and older. So that tells you that the results are unlikely to be valid, as I discussed at length. You can compare target trials with randomized controlled trials. And with genetics to understand confounding, you can combine several methods. Now, target trials versus RCTs has been done, and here's an excellent paper suggesting that you should always benchmark your observational methods by comparing randomized trials with the emulations of randomized trials. And here's a paper doing this, which did this with. So what does that say? I can't read that. Oh, it just says, benchmark them. It just says it's good to benchmark them, and then you can believe the results. And here's a paper that used electronic medical records to emulate target trials of sustained treatment strategies. And it looked at three things. It looked at statins, and it looked at statins combined with antihypertensives. So two things were reported in the abstract. And in both those cases, the target trial results came up with what you'd expect from randomized trials. But it seems there's one thing missing there, because, there's antihypertensives versus no antihypertensives. And they concluded that, when RCTs aren't available, observational analyses can get the right answers. And then there's one sentence in the discussion that says, in fact, when we tried to emulate a target trial of antihypertensives versus no antihypertensives, data not shown, the intention to treat hazard ratio suggested a 12% increased death rate in the treatment group. That's one sentence in the abstract, in the discussion. One might be suspicious that here a referee pointed this out and one sentence was added, not that I could know that, of course, but that one sentence was added to the discussion. And when thinking about strengthening causal inference from observational data, it was suggested that confounding adjustment is also infeasible for causal questions involving interventions, e.g. antihypertensive therapy, that are used almost exclusively by people with risk factors for the outcome. And then you sort of think, is it actually true that that's different for statins, where it's all risk-based guidelines? And so you can use genetics here to see the extent to which genetic proxies of risk predict antihypertensive use and statins. And the bottom line is, these results show two things. The bottom line is you look at your genetic risk predictors for coronary heart disease and stroke, and they predict statin and antihypertensive use, and therefore the confounding is likely to be similar. The second thing they show is that doctors do some things which are sort of reasonable, which is that the stroke score predicts antihypertensive use better than it does than for statins, and the CHD score predicts statin use better than antihypertensive use a little bit, which is probably right. But the confounding's the same. These are not sort of different questions. You could. That's a polygenic risk score for coronary heart disease and for stroke, and it's for standard deviation. The beta is for standard deviation in your polygenic risk score. Your polygenic risk score, because it's made up of a very large number of genetic variants, is completely normally distributed. So it's a standard deviation of a normally distributed polygenic risk score. So Mendelian randomization and regression discontinuity analysis. This is, I think, very challenging. I didn't think this would work particularly, but GWASs find genetic variants that predict educational attainment really reasonably strongly, highly replicably. And in UK Biobank, you also have the fact that they changed the year. In 1 year, they just changed whether you could leave school at 15 or 16. It was just changed. And that change led to about 6 months more schooling. Because, of course, the people who left at 15 had to get to 16 before they could leave. And some of them maybe liked school and who would have left, counterfactually. They liked school and stayed on. And what you show here is that these are predictions, so you have to read the paper. It's available to look at this in detail. But basically, the IV, the regression discontinuity and the MR both tended to predict slightly larger effect sizes or larger effect sizes than straightforward observation, reflecting the fact that IV does corrects for measurement error. But this greatly surprised me, because I was just after when you could leave at 15, and I thought it was impossible that making these kids stay on longer was having any beneficial effect for anybody, because the only reason they stayed on at school was so they could beat me up. So, but it did indeed actually have a beneficial effect. And then combining estimates. Well, whether you consider estimates combinable depends on the assumptions you're willing to make. And I won't go through this chart, but this should be appearing. Hopefully this will appear really quite soon. This is a paper about evidence triangulation, which talks you through how you should think about whether these are actually combinable. As I say, I'm happy to make this available to anyone who is actually thinking about doing this, or you can look at something which has now just gone up on medRxiv by Chinyang Shapland, which is looking at the beta-carotene example that I introduced in the beginning. And it looks at RCTs, observational studies, and Mendelian randomization of beta-carotene and its effects on coronary heart disease, and finds that the RCTs and MR predicted the same null effect, that the observational studies, just the crudely done, the observational studies are just taking their results, and they're not looking at the sort of potential for biases and the directions those biases would be expected to go in, was suggesting benefit, but when you had risk of bias corrected estimates, taking into account how strong you thought the bias was and the direction it went, then those became, firstly the estimates became less precise, as you would hope, and the effect moved to the null. So that's available on medRxiv for anyone who's interested in that. And I'm sort of ambivalent about the extent to which you can combine things. I think you've got to show every stage of your working, and you've got to work your way through this and then think about it, about combinability. I mean, some people, for example, advocate you should use the negative control outcome to calibrate the unobserved confounding. But I think in most situations, you don't think that the unobserved confounding, say for smoking and suicide and smoking and homicide, you don't think it's exactly identical. There'll be different, there'll be different factors. So it's rather a qualitative approach, I think. But I think this thing about combining estimates, I think this will be crucial for this announcement that was a few days ago about the Wellcome Trust and the ESRC, wanting to fund a sort of hub for putting together evidence that can actually create policies that actually work. This is an admirable thing to want to do, but I think this needs some methodological work, thinking about how you really do combine evidence. I think triangulation must be key to most of these syntheses, have to be done, in my view, under a triangulation hat. Of course, what we often see in epidemiological studies is that you have non-commensable evidence. You have evidence from cell systems, from animal studies, etc. I mean, what can you do with those evidence, with that evidence? Because it is real. Science is important. Proper science, as we sometimes call it in Bristol, is a real thing and has really helped humanity. The limits of conventional biological plausibility. I used to work on HIV for many years. I used to read the journals every month. We were looking at cofactors in male-female sexual transmission of HIV, and this appeared in 1991, and I was in the School of Hygiene Library. I read it, and I thought, yeah, that was quite convincing, because what you saw here was that it appeared that the oral contraceptive was reducing. Was increasing susceptibility to HIV. Effect on the genital mucosa, it leads to exproprium that makes it a less successful barrier, also immunosuppressive. I mean, you often get this in discussions. They list, if you don't like this one, here's another mechanism. But you don't see things that go in the opposite direction. So I thought, and then I walked down to the next journal, and in 1991, these really were out, within a few at the same time, and I read them the same day. And there was a paper when it was the reverse. Oral contraceptive use decreases risk. Sorry, no, this one decreases risk. I'm just going oral contraceptives thicken cervical mucus, which maybe it's meant to hamper entry. So yeah, so decreases risk. This one was increases risk. This one was decreases risk, and the decreases risk, their explanation was thicker cervical mucus. That sounds plausible as well. So, the problem is you can't just sort of take your choice. I think there is one thing which I've not seen done in epidemiology, which is done in climate science and has been done in other areas, but I think it would be really worth exploring, which is eliciting of expert priors. So in advance of doing your study, before you've actually got your data and when you're thinking of registering your protocol, you get people who know about these proper science areas, and you get them to give their priors, and you can use those priors for weighting, or it can be integrated into the evidence so far, and just say quantification is useful up to a certain limit. What I've talked about is triangulation relates really quite strongly with Bradford Hill viewpoints, in my view. And I'm going to finish with a crossword analogy, which was stolen from Susan Hack via Paul Rosenbaum, who gave me permission to use it. Although the crossword, I've got a Guardian crossword, I can't use a US crossword. So because I think the crossword analogy, what's important with the crossword analogy is when you do a crossword, it's not just the clues to the answer that you get that provides the scaffolding of your interpretation. Answers to other questions that actually show whether the method's working, like the benchmarking, etc., and benchmarking in the particular situation, that tells you about the methods, and that then strengthens what you're doing with them, etc. So it is a sort of scaffold. So, here you have convoluted, and it's like involved, confused, puzzling, tortuous, involute, baffling. There's a lot of answers to that, so you're not going to answer that one. Then you have A and O, for example. So this is a medical audience. What's the answer to A and O, for example? Blood types, or blood, it is actually, I put blood group, but it could be blood types. It's definitely blood group, blood types. Then Gangster's Girlfriend. Come on, it almost rolled off my tongue. I almost said it by mistake. It's so obvious. You've all seen film noir from the 40s and 50s. What's a gangster's girlfriend called? Mole, yeah. So you've got Mole. And then I doubt anyone here will know this, except people from near Newcastle could know this, or Scotland, is Besom. You either know it or you don't know it. And I want the Scottish version, which is less rude than the Newcastle one. A besom, you either know, if you know it, you know it. It's a broom. A besom is a broom, or there's a rude word which wouldn't really fit there, so that's okay. So now you get the O, and that gets you down to tortuous and confused, and then you get discharge of water and its outflow, so that then tells you think it's tortuous. And then you go through and you get the scaffolding, but it's the scaffolding. Blood group and mole could be one could be about that could be about the methods you're using and how they relate in this particular circumstance. Or some biological data against priors or whatever. They then help about the direct question you're answering. So I don't know if this works with people. This seems a bit. Airy-fairy, but I think it is that this scaffolding and this framework actually gives you stronger inference. And I'd like to recommend Paul Rosenbaum's observation experiment and his replication evidence factors. You've got to read the observation experiment first. They're brilliant. It's a brilliant book. So an example, I'll show you later. An example, just only one example, then honestly I'm going to finish very soon, would be parental inflammatory bowel disease and autism in children, where there have been suggestions from from some studies that maybe inflammatory bowel disease in mothers then increased the risk of autism in offspring. And in Swedish population registry observational studies, you do indeed show that maternal IBD has an effect. Much smaller risk shown with paternal IBD. The IBD polygenic score analysis in Alsbach showed the maternal IBD polygenic score predicted offspring autism traits in the child. The child's score was less predictive. We didn't have enough data in dads. And Mendelian randomization at individual level suggested IBD liability, but we haven't got enough mums to do the MR. But this, as then said, we now have a very strong hypothesis which we will test quite soon. We will now be testing it because at MOBA, the Norwegian Mother and Offspring study has been genotyped, 300,000 people. GWAS will have the father's score as the negative control, the mother's score, and we can look at autism traits. So we've now got a strong hypothesis which we're testing in a single study, which is the best to look at. You must develop your protocol and register it in advance. I mean, this sort of slide will be old hat to people here, is showing that when registration was brought in by the National Heart and Lung and Blood Institute. It's wonderful. It's just a wonderful example. These negative trials were just not really getting reported to the same extent as positive trials, and this single thing led to a step change in what was seen. Why you need to have your protocol developed in advance is because triangulation could be anything like, and it could be just like the biological plausibility. You can just pick if you look at lots of studies, you can then publish the two of them which actually agree with your prior hypothesis. But if you register in advance what methods you think are admissible, then you will avoid p-hacking, i.e. just reanalyzing your data till you got an answer which fitted with what you believed. Also, hypothesizing after the results have been seen, or harking. Once you know the results, it's very easy then to say, I hypothesize that what I've seen will be true. There's cognitive biases are removed. You need open access data. I've been shouting about this for 31 years. Indeed, I said that the BMJ should no longer accept papers unless people submitted their data on floppy disks. This really does date me. And Richard Smith, who was the editor, I said that if papers submitted to journals had to be accompanied by a disk copy, then people could check them and see if the results are the product of over-enthusiastic data torture. In this way, sharing of data could contribute to improving the quality of published research, and that there would be a fall in submissions to a journal. That would be the sign of success, would be the reduction in submissions. Richard Smith was enthusiastic, and he told me, I'm going to take it to the editorial board. And then he contacted me and said, it got one vote, which was mine. so the BMJ didn't implement it, although, of course, many journals have now implemented something close to this. Something I couldn't have even thought about at that time, open source code, which Ben and many others have been strong advocates of. All of that's true. You pre-register a detailed protocol. And, the thing is that prediction, when you have a hypothesis and you actually say it beforehand, then, in my view, that is just stronger evidence than when you have data and then you say this fits the data. Now, I love this paper. This is by the brilliant Peter Lipton, Testing Hypotheses, Prediction and Prejudice. I suggest everyone reads this. He was at Cambridge, but Cambridge is just like Oxford without the sort of ghosts of car industry, which is just a mini factory, a sad little mini factory left. Otherwise, they're identical. So, it's that Cambridge and Oxford philosophy. When he goes through why the common sense reasons I thought predicting in advance was strong, he clinically destroys this common sense. And then he brings in some other reasons which explain why it's correct. I love that. That's why people stay in Oxford. I went to the provinces, as Ben mentioned. But Lipton's book, Inference to the Best Explanation, is just a brilliant book that really has the background to triangulation, does provide the philosophical background. I show a protocol here. Deliberately, I show an old one because it takes a long, I nearly swore there, but I held myself back. It takes a long time to do these studies, so we registered this a long time ago, and we're still working on it. And the consensus relates to admissible evidence, not to the findings. I think that's absolutely key. So you want to almost get adversarial contributors. You don't want to get a group of people who all think one thing is going to be shown. You want a group who bring different viewpoints to say what is the admissible evidence, and you get a consensus on what is the admissible evidence before you look, before you do the study. This is really key, and I think would be transformative. The potential limitations are you could game the system, you could pre-register after you've done the study. You could do that, parking. I thought I'd invented that, but I discovered someone else had said it before, parking. But that is fraud. I think we should be straightforward about that pre-registration after the results are known is scientific fraud and should be treated as scientific fraud. And I'm sure discussions will raise more issues, and I'd like to thank these people who had all the ideas and did all the work. Thank you very much.
Hey, bravo. Do people have questions? And if you do, Unless we've got a microphone, I'll come close to you with this one.
So, unless you want to get your head. No, he's taking it up. Oh, no. Okay, your chance to have your head next to Ben's.
I've just had a haircut too.
Hey, thank you very much for the interesting lecture. I have two questions. One is, earlier you said that a lot of observational studies claim to be real-world evidence or using real-world data. So what is actually considered real-world data? And my second question is, what do you think about statistical techniques used in observational studies, such as propensity score matching, as a causal inference technique to estimate the effects of treatment? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. So I always find the term real-world data. It's not a term I use, which is why I put it up at the other people propose that. The only data I ever use is real-world data, because it's the real. We live in the real world, and one's using data. Whether it's mice or whatever, it is real-world data. I think real-world data is basically code for not doing randomized controlled trials when you should do a randomized controlled trial, or you should try to do a randomized controlled trial if it's possible. Or you use data to try and get the best hypotheses to then test in a randomized controlled trial. Just like I would always say with Mendelian randomization, which in my view should always be triangulated, if it can be, that what it should do is it should help focus that you get better outcomes in trials you actually do, that you have stronger evidence for deciding to launch a trial. If you can do a trial, they should be done, in my opinion. Propensity scores are basically the same as multivariable adjustment. I know there's been strong proponents arguing they're not. All examples I've seen of propensity score analysis and matching produce the same sorts of results as you get through standard observation analyses. And as I talked about in my Mendelian randomization talk, what you often see in situations where you now know that there's no causal effect, is you see a sort of relative risk of 0.5 reduced to 0.3 on adjustment, but it still remains, massively statistically robust. And in situations where there's substantial confounding, I think statistical adjustment is limited. You need to think of other ways of getting inference. In situations where things aren't that confounded, and I think the example here would be vaccine use, when the vaccine use became possible for people at given set ages at different times, unless they were or people who had very particular characteristics. In those situations, I think you get sensible answers from those data. I think it's an open question, which I'd very much like to see tested, would be target trials versus, really against randomized controlled trials, and seeing how the different methods work.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. One question. You just suggested, for example, for Mendelian randomization studies, that they more or less should always be accompanied by triangulated with another sort of orthogonal evidence. So some sorts are easier to come by. A negative control outcome analysis may be easier to do than to come by with a plausible source of exogenous variation that allows for a regression discontinuity study, or let alone a trial.
Yeah.
So my question is, at which stage do you think it's viable to encourage triangulation? At the synthesis of evidence across several studies, doing it in different ways? Or is it also viable to encourage people, really collect it into the same study and try to publish it?
No, I think you can. I think when you can do them in the same study, then that obviously has certain power. But I think the issue is with the same for Mendelian randomization is thinking of pre-registered protocol. Is actually thinking through which things can be used in that situation. I mean, zero relevance points, negative controls, and MR are very straightforward to do, as I was saying. So I think it's at the protocol stage. I think that should be thought.
Isn't one of the big challenges here that for a lot of what you might teach on a Stats Epi course, there's an unambiguous manual of how to do it?
Unambiguous?
Manual of how to do it.
Yeah.
You can operationalize it. Whereas if you're trying to encourage people to think about how lots of different forms of evidence come together, you can only do that in a kind of narrative, discursive way.
Yeah.
And if you can't operationalize it, in particular because you're only ever going to be doing it on contested questions,
Yeah.
what's the path forward in the real world? Like, how does it help? Because you're just going to get people throwing rocks at each other and comparing different things. Is there a way of taking what you're saying here and putting it into a rule book that can resolve questions for the $70 million evidence bank?
Yeah. So I think it is. This notion I had about pre-registering protocols with groups who have different views on topics. So you do that in advance, and you get what we've had in medicine is these terrible consensus conferences, or nonsensus conferences, as they might be called, because what people do is they get people they know who agree with them, and then they call it a consensus conference, and then these days they call it a Lancet Commission or something, and it gets published, and they all agree. You've got to actually. I think it's a difficult thing to do. People have called them adversarial collaborations, for example. I think it's difficult to do, but I think funders, just like funders had a really good, had a powerful effect when they said you've got to do meta-analyses of previous trials before we'll fund your trial, for example. I think funders could have a real role in this. I think funders should say, we're not going to fund you unless unless you do this in this way. You get other viewpoints engaged. And I put in a big welcome application, which they turned down, which was to do that on 3 topics, but sadly it was rejected. But
one more question, and any more anywhere else? All right, go.
Thanks for the very interesting talk. I wanted to ask about actually interpreting the conclusions from many of these studies, and in particular in reference to a paper from yourself and Jonathan Stern in 2001 called Sifting the Evidence. And in particular, whether the background rate of potentially true hypotheses, which probably sits somewhere between 5 and 10% these days, can this actually be incorporated formally when interpreting these conclusions? And if so, then how could we go about that?
I think that's a very interesting question. I mean, I think the background rate changes depending exactly on very much on the question you're looking at. I mean, we're very lucky in the genomics field because you really can calculate the genome-wide. You can say how many possible things, in principle, how many possible things can you test? How many markers are there that are actually independent enough? And then you take those into account, and that's how 10 to the minus 8, 5 times 10 to the minus 8 was sort of arrived at, which has stood up reasonably well for the sort of truly independent tests. I can't think of really many other situations where you can do anything more than sort of hand wave about what the background rate is. But I think then the background rate of saying something which survives a series of different methods, at the very least, the background rate of something that survives those methods would increase. Whether I never feel that one should introduce just a new threshold. I think that's a bit silly. I mean, this group who got together and said, let's say P is 0.001, that's significant. I mean, I nearly swore again, but I've been very good. I'm not. I don't think you come up with some magic number. I think it actually has to be something which is discussed. But I think this is the thing where if you did have an adversarial collaboration type format, or you have people who have different beliefs about it, that is actually one thing that could be discussed in the protocol development. And I am on one because the thing you've got to do if you work collaboratively is, however arrogant you are, eventually you realize that collaborative working means that you have to go with the majority. I am on a triangulation of evidence pre-registered protocol which gives the p-value that we think, not we, they think, but I'm part of the team, so it is we. I've got to embrace it that we've in advance put forward.
All right. Well, there are some people I have to say thank you to. Thank you to Will Hume and Hilary Winstanley, who've organised a 2-day visit from George. This is the first Bennett Lecture in what will be an eternal series going on forever, because that's how endowments work. Thank you very much to Peter Bennett and the Peter Bennett Foundation for their support of all of our work. And the thing about going on for eternity is you can invent traditions. It's my proud duty to present George Davey Smith with the first ever bottle of Bennett Institute port. This is bottle 0001, so we've left enough in the namespace for another few centuries of that, and we'll be taking note of who has those. I'm afraid you get bottle number 2, Peter Bennett. So please join me in thanking George Davey Smith, and there is warm white wine and cold red wine upstairs.
Great,
Bravo.
thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.